They're saying things like, Caelynn is changing so much for Dean. She's doing all these things. And it's like, there's a lot of like underlying misogyny in that.
What do fans think about you that is the biggest misconception, would you say?
I hate when people, you go.
No, I want to hear what you
No,
say.
you go.
Dean's very sarcastic and he has a very dry sense of humor. And I think people take what he says so literally. And they're like, you know, the DMs that I get are just insane. Like, you need to get some self-esteem because if he doesn't tell you he loves you, and I'm like, of course, you know, we've been together for 2 years. He tells me he loves me. He's an amazing partner. And I think you are. Great boyfriend. So yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception is just like people twisting his words or just taking him so literally. And that is something you should just never do.
Yeah, it's tricky when people insert themselves into a relationship. And like, don't get me wrong, we're super grateful for everything that like we've been given. But at the end of the day, it's like we choose what we allow people to see within our relationship, and then they take that and they like disparage our relationship because it's unfamiliar to them. You know, like it doesn't make sense in their world, so they lash out at us or in the comment section or something like that. Which like whatever, like it's not the biggest deal in the world. But my biggest gripe with all of that stuff is there's a lot of like misogynistic undertones in the things that they're saying. They're saying things like, Caelynn is changing so much for Dean. She's doing all these things. And it's like, there's a lot of like underlying misogyny in that. Like she's a full grown woman making all of her own decisions. And like if she didn't like something, like she would leave and she would make sure it suited her appropriately. Like, and I feel funny like saying this because it's your experiences, but I'm kind of inserting myself, I guess. But that's my biggest gripe with it all is like, if she didn't want to do any of this stuff, like she just wouldn't do it. She like is a very intelligent person that wants to experience all these new things, and we experience a lot of new things together, and we experience a lot of new things separately, and people just seem to fully bypass that and be like, oh my gosh, she spends 3 nights a month in Dean's van, she's changed completely for him. And it's like, no, she's still her whole individual person. We just like to do things together and separately sometimes, you know?
Yeah. It also is kind of awesome to be able to take off, you know, from life and just be together on the road. You know, it's not a bad thing.
Oh my God. Oh, that's what I say too. It's like, it's not like we're like doing drugs and going to clubs and getting wasted all the time. We're going outside and like we're hiking around and we're experiencing nature, new things. It's like
kind of awesome.
I don't think anyone could ever say anything negative about that stuff, but people find ways. And if you can't tell it irks me just a little tiny bit, just a tiny little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. I'll finish.
I'm sure some words that may have gotten a little misconstrued. I think this week you said something about Caelynn being suffocating, but it's a good thing. So I'm sure you saw headlines. Yeah. So, you know, what was that? Do you regret saying things when you say things like that? Because they do get misconstrued.
I mean, yeah, if I knew that it was going to be such a grabby headline, the suffocating thing was like, there was a topic in our podcast about like someone's girlfriend was suffocating and whether or not it was good or bad. And suffocating is definitely like a bad adjective to use in any terms whenever you're talking about the relationship. But in the context of the conversation we were having, like they were talking about suffocating, and then so Jared and I were trying to like put our own experiences onto being suffocated. You know what I mean? So that's why we kept using and reusing that word. And you take it out of context, or you take a small blurb out of it, and it sounds bad because it is bad. And even the conversation in context probably wasn't great either. But it's like, I guess I do regret it.
But I don't know. And then that goes back to like me knowing Dean, and he's like very much like a solo guy and loves to be alone. So I would never take that and like be upset by it, because I'm like, I love to be with him all the time, and I know that can be suffocating or over whatever you want to term you want to use. So like that's an instance where I'm like, that does not bother me in the slightest.
But also I guess I was saying all that stuff as like normally in my experiences through life is like I like to be like a lone wolf, like a lone ranger kind of guy. But when Caelynn suffocates me, as we talked about on the podcast, I tend to enjoy it a lot more than I would have in the past, or like more than I would in theory, you know? So I agree, bad terminology, but
maybe don't put it in your vows one day.
Right. Right.
Or
I'll find a way to work that in if it gets to that.